Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. To get us back on schedule after a chaotic few weeks, and because we spent so long discussing Tom Bombadil in last week's episode, and by the way, a sincere thank you to everyone who has written to me about that episode. These discussions have been so fun. But to get ourselves back into our groove here on Shire Reckoning, this week I have set aside the usual first segment of the show and allowed the listener Q&A segment to take over completely. This week, a bushelful of listener questions on topics as diverse as the nature of good and evil, the bad boy of the First Age, and a possible fallout of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. And then, of course, we'll wrap up the show by opening up the almanac and taking a look at what's been happening among fans and critics of Tolkien's work over the last week. To begin, well, we've got a couple of questions that are going to draw upon material from the Silmarillion, and I know that I'm bad at mentioning this, but there's a chance that you might be listening to Shire Reckoning without being aware of the 6-month project I completed earlier this year, studying the Silmarillion in depth. You can find all, something close to 50 hours of podcast material over on my genre fiction show Stars and Swords, available at starsandswords.com. And since I'm mentioning Stars and Swords, please do join me this week if you are so inclined as we begin a brand new unit looking at influential science fiction and the book chosen by the patrons of the Next Word Patreon, William Gibson's 1984 cyberpunk novel Neuromancer, a science fiction heist story with a lot to say about transhumanism, about technology, about culture. It is fantastic, and we will be discussing part 1 later this week. But back to Tolkien, back to the Silmarillion, and to this question from Steph. Quote, Tolkien always draws clear lines between his heroes and his villains, and we can easily tell the good from the bad. But if, as Ilúvatar says, there is good because there is evil, then isn't it fair to say that Sauron is as much a part of the good of Middle-earth as Galadriel, or that Gollum is as important as Samwise? End quote. This is a really interesting question, Steph, because it is one of those questions that gets right to the heart of what Tolkien is exploring through his act of secondary creation. More than that, even, I think you can argue that thinking through these kinds of questions is one of the things that secondary creation, that art, allows us to do. In the Ainulindalë, Tolkien's creation myth, Ilúvatar invites the Ainur to make music together. Melkor, brash and prideful, tries to dominate the music, and Ilúvatar responds by saying this, quote, Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor, but that he may know and all the Ainur that I am Ilúvatar. Those things that ye have sung I will show them forth, and ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. End quote. So that's it, right? Just as Steph said, there is no theme, no act of secondary creation that doesn't have its source in Ilúvatar and will ultimately, therefore, be turned to good. We return to this idea with a little more nuance at the beginning of chapter 11 of the Quenta Silmarillion, where the Valar are reflecting on their conflict with Fëanor, more on whom in a moment. Manwë says, quote, Thus even as Eru spoke to us, shall beauty not before conceived be brought into Ea, and evil yet be good to have been. But Mando said, And yet remain evil. To me shall Fëanor come soon. End quote. Mando's here the doomsman of the Valar, the summoner of the souls of the slain, he who remembers everything that was and will be, making us close here to a statement on moral philosophy that we get in the pages of the Silmarillion. Yes, evil will be turned to good. Yes, it will still be evil. How do we resolve this paradox? And the problem here is one of perspective, because you're right, Steph, if you live in a world underpinned by the benevolence of an omnipotent God, then everything in the end turns to good. Even pain and suffering and grief, we might imagine, are eventually transmuted into happiness. And any temporary condition, no matter how negative, pales in comparison to a permanent state of bliss. But if everything eventually turns to good, well, how are we supposed to measure morality? Because, of course, there's an argument that if every action, no matter what it is, ultimately leads to a good outcome, then the most moral people are those people who take the largest number of actions, thereby creating the maximum opportunity for Ilúvatar's grace. By contrast, the worst thing you could do, from the perspective of an inhabitant of a marred world like Arda, is sit quietly at home, podcasting about a book. You should be out there breaking things, making more cracks in the world so the light can get in. That is the most generative action that you can take. But Mandos tells us emphatically, clearly, that this isn't true. Evil actions aren't made good in retrospect simply because the outcome is good. And this is Tolkien creating a very strong argument against consequentialism, against what is called teleological moral philosophy. This can be thought of as a kind of the ends justify the means kind of philosophy. We are concerned with outcomes. We're concerned with the consequences of our actions. Sure, I did a bad thing, but a good thing happened because of it. I stole bread to feed my family. I killed an enemy soldier in a time of war, thereby doing my part to win the peace. This is a very modern, very subjective kind of morality. But because Tolkien believes that the world is ultimately good, and because any action will inevitably be turned to good, we can't rely on teleological ethics to make any kind of judgment, because the consequences of any action on a long enough timeline will be positive. Sure, Smaug attacks Erebor and destroys Dale and kills thousands or tens of thousands and devastates the region, but ultimately, that leads Thorin and company to recover the Lonely Mountain, to settle their relationship with the elves of Thranduil's kingdom, and stabilize the region to act as a bulwark against Sauron's forces in the War of the Ring. Therefore, was Smaug really bad? And the unambiguous, unequivocal answer is yes. Because Tolkien removes the focus of our moral judgment from the consequences of the action and puts it instead on the action itself. This is deontological ethics, the ethics of the act itself, which tells us that we can't ever really take the credit or the blame for the consequences of an action because a benevolent god is operating behind the scenes, perhaps, or because the world is ultimately too chaotic, or because who can ever really trace cause and effect in this tumultuous world anyway? So instead, we focus on the intention underpinning the act itself. Are you meaning to do good or ill? Are you trying to help or to hurt? Or, more appropriately for Tolkien, perhaps, are you respectful of others? Or are you trying to control them, to dominate them, to make them yours? This doesn't mean, parenthetically, that we can't have really fascinating conversations about the consequences of these evil actions, but per the rules of Tolkien's Legendarium, they will nonetheless remain evil. I hope, Steph, that clarifies things. I find it such an interesting topic of conversation, as you can doubtless tell. If we have more specific examples, I would love to get into the weeds here a little bit, as in fact we're going to with our second question this evening. Speaking of good and evil and best and worst simultaneously, I received this question from Fergus, from my old stomping grounds in the northeast of Scotland. Fergus writes, quote, I like hearing very much your thoughts about the particular and peculiar perspectives of the text, so I'm curious what you make of Fëanor. The book seems to think he's the best thing since sliced bread, but a more objective observer might see him as a monster. Is Fëanor's goodness elvish propaganda, or are we really supposed to see Fëanor as a tragic figure? End quote. Thank you, Fergus. I have got to say, I find the Fëanor argument to be constantly and consistently surprising, particularly the pro-Fëanor, anti-Valar perspective, which argues that the Golden Boy of Valinor didn't do anything wrong in the first place because, wow, he did so much wrong. Let's recap. For those of you who haven't picked up your Silmarillion recently, let's recap the story of Fëanor. He's born in Valinor, the only child of Finwë and Midiel, and when he is born, he drains so much energy from his mother that she goes to lay down in the healing gardens of Lorien, and her spirit passes into the halls of Mandos, and she does not return. We are told, quote, but in the bearing of her son Miriel was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labour of living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor. End quote. Which, is a lot for a kid to deal with. Fëanor grows up in Valinor. Eventually, his father remarries, which is basically unprecedented in elven culture at that point, and Fëanor finds himself with two half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin, and yes, if you read your Peoples of Middle-earth, specifically the Shibboleth of Fëanor, two half-sisters too. And Fëanor is, let's be clear, amazing. He is the dude. He perfects the written alphabet used by elves. He arguably, though I have some thoughts on this, invents the Palantiri, and then, after repeatedly asking his niece Galadriel for strands of her hair for no particular reason, he goes off and creates the Silmarils themselves, 3 gemstones embodying the light of the trees of Valinor. So far, so good, particularly if you're willing to skip over the creepy behavior with Galadriel. But 2 things are happening now with Fëanor at this point in his story. His lust and his jealousy for the Silmarils. Quote, Fëanor began to love the Silmarils with a greedy love, and grudged the sight of them to all save his father and his 7 sons. He seldom remembered now that the light within them was not his own. End quote. At the same time, he's developing this rivalry with Fingolfin, which is often presented by readers as being entirely one-sided, by the way, but in the interests of mutual balance here, we're told that there is a certain reciprocity from Fingolfin too. Quote, "High princes were Fëanor and Fingolfin, the elder sons of Finwë, honoured by all in Aman, but now they grew proud and jealous, each of his rights and his possessions." End quote. All of this, we should note, is being fanned into flame by Melkor, who was out there just wandering around Valinor, dripping poison in the ears of any who will listen. As a specific result of this, Melkor convinces Fëanor, who ironically believes the whole time that he is resisting the lure of Melkor's lies, he convinces Fëanor that his brother Fingolfin is plotting against him. This leads to Fëanor's people manufacturing swords for the first time, and Fëanor drawing his weapon on his brother during a party. Fëanor is then banished as punishment, and along with his 7 sons, his dad, and his Silmarils, Fëanor goes north and builds the fortress of Formenos, wherein he broods for 5 long years. After which time, he is summoned by Manwë to reconcile with his brother, which he does. Unfortunately, that's the moment when Melkor and Ungoliant attack, destroying the trees of Valinor, then heading north to Formenos, where they kill Fëanor's dad, Finwë, and take the Silmarils before fleeing to Middle-earth. And there is a moment right then in Valinor when the Valar and the elves realize that the trees have been destroyed, but that there is still hope, because with the aid of the Silmarils, the trees might be remade. And before he knows that they have been stolen from his vaults by Melkor, Fëanor refuses to hand them over. He and his sons swear their famous oath, the first part of which is this, quote, "Be he foe or friend, be he foul or clean, brood of Morgoth or bright Vala, Elda or Maya or aftercomer, man yet unborn upon Middle-earth, neither law nor love nor league of swords, dread nor danger nor doom itself shall defend him from Fëanor and Fëanor's kin, who hideth or hoardeth or in hand taketh, finding keepeth or afar casteth a Silmaril." End quote. This leads directly to the rebellion of the Noldor, who immediately go to the coastal city of Alcolonde and kill the Teleri, the elves who live there in the first recorded kinslaying. Fëanor and his people take the boats of the Teleri, betraying even Fingolfin his brother, and sail back to Middle-earth, launching themselves into the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the battle under stars, where Fëanor is, somewhat ironically, mortally wounded by Gothmog the Balrog, and as he dies and experiences a moment of clarity wherein he understands that the elves will never be able to win this war against Melkor, he nonetheless commands his sons to keep their oaths. He dies, and 500 years of battle and bloodshed fall upon Beleriand until the War of Wrath. So it's pretty clear that Fëanor stands at the heart of a maelstrom of bad decisions and terrible consequences. He causes, arguably, more death and destruction than any other child of Iluvatar. The only comparable figure, the only person who I think can even stand close to him, would be Ar-Pharazôn, who leads Numenor to its destruction at the end of the Second Age. But even then, I'm not at all sure. But the problem is this. Fëanor is, actually, a kind of a sympathetic figure. It isn't his fault that he is born with this excess of power and greatness into a world in which power and greatness lead invariably to corruption and darkness. It's Fëanor that Manwë and Mandos are talking about when Mandos says that evil shall remain evil, as we discussed in response to Steph's question earlier. This is from a little earlier in that passage, quote, "And they mourned not more for the death of the trees than for the marring of Fëanor. Of the works of Melkor, one of the most evil. For Fëanor was made the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, in valour, in endurance, in beauty, in understanding, in skill, in strength, and in subtlety alike of all the children of Iluvatar. And a bright flame was in him. The works of wonder for the glory of Arda that he might otherwise have wrought, only Manwë might in some measure conceive." End quote. Fëanor is the greatest of the elves, but in that greatness comes his own undoing. Now, obviously, see our previous conversation about evil acts remaining evil. I don't say this because I'm a Fëanor defender or because I don't think he's a walking disaster. I say this because Tolkien encourages us to see both sides, to understand the real tragedy of the fall. And this is one of many ways, I think, in which Tolkien just operates on a different level from most fantasy authors, particularly those fantasy authors who rose in his shadow. Redemption stories are a dime a dozen in modern fantasy. We're accustomed to characters who have done the worst things imaginable suddenly being rehabilitated because they've had a change of heart. Tolkien understood that such transformations are rare, that actions are the product of character, that Fëanor makes the choices he makes, not because he's laboring under some momentary delusion or a fleeting shadow, but because those are the choices that a person like Fëanor would make. The tragedy, in the Greek sense, isn't in the choices, it's in his nature. And we see from the genuinely tragic death of Miriel, Fëanor was doomed from the beginning. And we might well argue that it's even possible for someone like him to make other choices, to do better than he did, marred as he is by the works of Melkor from the conception of Arda, and marred again by the campaigns and lies of Melkor in Valinor. Then granted both an excess of power and the belief that he is beset by enemies. If you are so star-spangled special that you can invent the Silmarils, isn't it kind of inevitable that you're going to fall under the sway of desire and jealousy and selfishness? Well, no, I don't necessarily think so if we're talking about the real world, but the power of power itself to corrupt is essential to our understanding of Tolkien's secondary creation. And I think that there is no clearer example of that than Fëanor. So to answer your question more clearly, Fergus, I would say that Fëanor is a tragic figure, though the nature of that tragedy is not what we might expect, but that doesn't let him off the hook for some really bad, calamitous, disastrous choices. Thank you so much for your question, Fergus. Lastly, we leave the Silmarillion behind for a question from Angela, which I have to say is one of these questions that just stopped me dead in my tracks and makes me wonder how I never thought of it before today. Angela writes very directly, quote, "What happens to the ring worn by the Witch-King of Angmar after he's killed at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields? I hate the thought of Bergil finding it after the war and the whole thing starting up again." End quote. Angela, this is brilliant. It's particularly brilliant because, upon investigation, it points to one of those rare contradictions within the text of The Lord of the Rings. A quick recap for those joining us late. In the Second Age, the Rings of Power, heard of them, were forged in Eregion under the influence of Sauron. 9 of them were taken and given to men who become great leaders and kings before eventually falling to the power of the One Ring worn by Sauron. They become wraith-like figures, the Black Riders, the Nazgul, the greatest of Sauron's servants. In the Council of Elrond in The Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf is asked how he knows that Frodo's ring is the One Ring, he says, quote, "The 9 the Nazgul keep, the 7 are taken or destroyed." At this Glóin stirred, but he did not speak. "The 3 we know of. What then is this one that he desires so much?" End quote. So from that, we infer, as Gandalf infers, that the ringwraiths wear their own rings. And thus, when the Witch-King of Angmar is slain by Éowyn with an all-time assist from Meriadoc Brandybuck, the ring may well fall to the ground. But what's strange here is that even within the text, Tolkien contradicts himself. And then, in the supporting material, very clearly takes one particular perspective, because in The Shadow of the Past, the second chapter of Book 1, Gandalf is laying out the situation to Frodo, and he says for the first time what he knows of the Rings of Power. "So it is now. The 9 he has gathered to himself, the 7 also, or else they are destroyed. The 3 are hidden still. But that no longer troubles him. He only needs the 1. End quote. So there he believes that Sauron has taken back the 9, that the ringwraiths don't in fact carry them on their wraith-like persons after all. This presumably happened sometime in the Third Age, after Sauron's defeat at the hands of Isildur. It's possible that Gandalf learns from Elrond and the others at the council, or let's say from Saruman during the intervening time, that in fact the Nazgul do carry their rings, and he is correcting his earlier statement at the Council of Elrond. But this isn't all that Tolkien has to say on the matter. In the Unfinished Tales, in the chapter titled The Hunt for the Ring, we learn that Sauron, having learned of Gollum's capture by Aragorn, sends all of his agents to try and get more information, but he is thwarted both by the skill of the Rangers and the treachery of Saruman. So he decides to bide his time, and we get this line, quote, "At length he resolved that no others would serve him in this case but his mightiest servants, the ringwraiths, who had no will but his own, being each utterly subservient to the ring that had enslaved him, which Sauron held." End quote. Later in the same chapter, the point is made again, even more emphatically. Quote, "At length, therefore, he resolved to use the ringwraiths. He had been reluctant to do so until he knew precisely where the ring was for several reasons. They were by far the most powerful of his servants, and the most suitable for such a mission, since they were entirely enslaved to their 9 rings, which he now himself held. They were quite incapable of acting against his will, and if one of them, even the Witch-King their captain, had seized the One Ring, he would have brought it back to his master. End quote. So, it seems that Gandalf misspeaks during the Council of Elrond, and that Sauron holds the Lesser Rings himself in Barad-dûr, so there is no inconveniently magically radioactive treasure left behind on the Pelennor fields after the slaying of the Witch-King of Angmar. And here's the even better news, Angela, if you're unconvinced by that earlier process. Even if Gandalf is right at the council, even if the Nazgul do carry their own rings, and the Witch-King's ring falls to the ground after he is slain, it gets trodden into the dirt only to be found by some enterprising young Gondorian in the years to come, we can be pretty confident from the loss of the power of the Elven rings that the destruction of the One Ring in Mount Doom renders all the other rings powerless too. So even if Burgil, son of Beregond, finds it, he'll be okay. Though, I must admit, it is a hell of a sequel hook if you were so inclined. And with that, we will wrap up this first segment and return in a moment with our almanac. Before we take a break, however, a huge thank you to Steph and to Fergus and to Angela. If you have questions about any aspect of the Legendarium or the movies, or hey, even the video games, get in touch and let me know. You can email shirereckoningpod@gmail.com, or you can find Shire Reckoning Pod on YouTube, on Blue Sky, and for now at least, on Instagram. And if you have a moment and you like what you hear, then please consider supporting Shire Reckoning and the Next Word Network. I think that what we do here at Next Word and the community that we're building, the independent ad-free podcasts that you're listening to right now, I think they're all pretty special, and I appreciate every dollar that helps us pay for our expenses and to cover the, frankly, surprising amount of time that these podcasts take to put together. If you can afford to pledge your support, please visit patreon.com/nextword, and even if you can't spare any support right now, which I completely understand, then head on over to patreon.com/nextword anyway. Sign up for free, and you'll get email updates and links for the live sessions that we hold every week, looking, for the moment, at the text of The Hobbit. Thank you all so much for listening. It is a busy week in publication history. On November 9th, 1933, Tolkien publishes his poem Errantry, which will later become Eärendil was a Mariner, in the Oxford magazine. 34 years later to the day, on November 9th, 1967, Smith of Wootton Major would also be published. On the 11th of November, in addition, in 1918 to the end of the Great War, in 1954, The Two Towers is published for the first time. And on the 14th of November in 1986, The Shaping of Middle-earth, the fourth volume of the history of Middle-earth, is published in the United States. 4 years later, and The War of the Ring, the eighth volume, is released on that self-same date. And if all of that isn't enough, then November 15th marks the 47th anniversary of the release of the Ralph Bakshi animated version of The Lord of the Rings. So if you weren't sure what you were doing this coming Saturday night, now you know. The other interesting anniversary that we're celebrating, well, marking this week, comes on November 13th, which happens to be the 8th anniversary of the acquisition by Amazon Studios of global television rights for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit for the modest sum of $250 million, which, as was noted at the time by Forbes, is 1,000 times as much as Tolkien was paid for the original rights in 1969. It's 125 times more than J.K. Rowling received from Warner for the first 4 Harry Potter books, and it's approximately the same as the entire production budget for the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy. The estimated all-in production cost for 5 seasons of whatever the series turned out to be was, at the time, $500 million. The estimated costs now, not including the license fee, is $1.2 billion, or almost $1.5 billion, all in. That makes Rings of Power, by far, the most expensive TV show ever produced. It is more expensive than all of the Marvel shows, than all of the Star Wars shows. It's more expensive than Stranger Things. It is more expensive than Severance. It is more than 6 times more expensive, on average, episode by episode, than Game of Thrones. That means, by the way, that Amazon needs 3 million people to sign up for Prime at full price and to stay with Prime for the entire duration of the run of the show to even stand a chance of earning out on this investment. The economics of television have never made less sense, particularly since we're only a week out from the laying off of 14,000 people from Amazon gaming divisions, which seems to include the complete shuttering of 2 Tolkien-related game projects, including a new multiplayer online role-playing game intended to compete with The Lord of the Rings Online. This week in the fandom, well, it's only been 5 minutes since I recorded the last episode of Shire Reckoning, so I don't have much that is new, but I do have a couple of things that I wanted to recommend. A couple for your calendar here. I wanted to note that the fine folks at the Prancing Pony podcast have announced their call for papers for the moot that they are holding in December in Dallas. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it there this year, despite it only being 3.5, 4 hours from here, but I am planning on attending at least one moot next year, so stay tuned for more information on that. Also, for your calendars, AMC theaters all over the country will be screening the extended editions of the Jackson Lord of the Rings movies on January 16th, 17th, and 18th, 2026. I know that's all the way in the new year, but I would expect those dates to sell out fast. So if you are interested, as I am, I suggest you get your tickets soon. I would also like to recommend the album In the Forest Singing Sorrowless by self-described creator of Celtic pagan folk music, Joy Shannon. It is haunting music, it is hopeful, it is genuinely lovely. The link is in the show notes to the Bandcamp page. I particularly like, to no one's great surprise, the song Faramir. And that is going to do it for this slightly shorter episode of Shire Reckoning. And now that we're back on our regular schedule, the show will be a little more predictable going forward. Well, predictable in form and function, if not in content completely. Thanks again to Steph and to Fergus and to Angela and to you at home for listening. If you have questions, if you have comments, please do get in touch. And if you like the show, tell a friend, tell somebody you know, tell somebody in your Tolkien reading group or on your Tolkien mailing list, or just yell at a stranger in the street. Hey, have you heard about the Shire Reckoning thing? Are you into, nerd stuff? You should check it out. That does more for the show than any amount of advertising dollar spend or grassroots motivation on social media. The personal connection is what it's all about. That's going to do it for Shire Reckoning this week. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, Aure and Teluva.